Hello and welcome to the Rubrik Zero Labs Summit. Today's summit is sponsored by Rubrik Zero Labs and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech and I'm excited to be your moderator today. Now, the theme of this summit is the journey to secure an uncertain future. Understanding and preparing for risk is tricky, especially when it comes to your data. We tend to be optimistic when we prepare for risk, even when assessing the strength of our cybersecurity, which is a topic infamous for its fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Our hope and goodwill often outweigh our actual ability to thwart and recover from attacks. Rubrik Zero Labs assessed both the overall sentiments surrounding data security and the actual on the ground realities in its annual report to see how prepared organizations are and what it will take to secure their futures. So, for the first three segments of this summit, Steve Stone, who's the head of Rubrik Zero Labs, will be joined by different cybersecurity veterans to learn how they assess and navigate risk and talk about what you can do to prepare your organization for the next 5 years. So, through this summit, we're going to cover why you're probably underprepared to secure your organization's data, even if you're pretty confident about it right now, how to recalibrate your approach to data security based on our analysis of on the ground realities, and actionable steps that you can take to better secure your organization's data now and in the future. So it's going to be a great summit. And before we get to that content, we do have a couple of housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. We'll have team members responding to questions during the live event, and those that we missed during the summit will go back to Rubrik for follow-up. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now next, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources, and I'd especially like to call your attention to the link to the Rubrik Zero Labs report. A lot of the panelists are going to be talking about that report in today's sessions, and you can get more detail from the report itself at that link. So we've got three great segments coming up today. And to kick us off, we've got Stephen Stone, again, who's the head of the Rubrik Zero Labs, in a discussion with Daniel Newman, who's CEO and Chief Analyst of the Futurum Group. So let's turn things over to Daniel to start the conversation.
Steve Stone, head of Rubrik Zero Labs, joins me here today to talk a little bit about what's going on, some new reports, new data, and we're going to talk about cyber resilience and so much more. Steve, great to have the opportunity to sit down with you.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for this.
So give us the background. Tell us a little bit about Rubrik. Give us a little bit about your role as the head of the Rubrik Zero Lab and how Rubrik Zero Labs came to be.
So, really kind of starting off, what we're really here to do as Rubrik's goal is to make organizations more resilient by safeguarding their most precious commodity, which is data. We really view everything through the lens of data. So, as we look at that larger Rubrik mission, what we do here in Rubrik Zero Labs, we're your fairly typical threat research element you see at a lot of security companies. Our job's pretty straightforward. We're here to understand and prioritize the threat landscape and then convert that to actionable decision points. And our focus is also on data, just based on what our parent company in Rubrik does. And that's what we're here to do.
Such an important role, such an important thing for security companies to be focused on evaluating threats, helping their communities to deal with the rising threat surfaces. And of course, having had conversations across your organization, including with your CEO, Bipul, I can sense the company's dedication to helping its customers identify and deal with the growing threat landscape. Now, this is the third State of Data Security report since the inaugural Rubrik Zero Labs last November. Am I right? So,
That's correct.
okay.
This is our third one.
So, talk about how this report differs from the past.
So what it really comes down to is as we at Zero Labs have really tried to do what a number of other cybersecurity organizations do, which is look at our data, speak with the right leaders in our space, and then put together what we think is an appropriate research topic. Those things that are very traditional in cybersecurity, as we started doing those inside of data security, we found that there's not a lot of really good tangible touch points. So we really had to kind of step back and say, let's put some of those touch points out there in real meaningful ways. So with that lens, the first report we focused on, what are the impacts to people? As we do data security, how is this impacting our teams, our leaders, our operations? Then with the previous report that we did, we focused on what do we think are some of the important ways to approach data security? How much data are we actually securing? What kind of threats is it facing? And what is able to be prioritized inside of that larger topic of data security? And all of those in the last report were really with an eye on where are things at today. And what's been interesting with this newest report, the one we've launched this week, is we basically took the key findings of that last report and we went to the left and right of that, meaning we basically said, here's where we're at today. We wanted to answer this very basic question of, is data defensible? In 2023, can we defend our data? So we looked back several years. We understood the trends that got us from yesterday to today. And then we took those same trends and extrapolated them 1 year and 5 years forward to say, let's now answer that question, not just can we defend data today, but this path that we're on, we're heading in a direction. Where is that taking us? And that really became the central premise of this most recent research effort.
Yeah. So first of all, appreciate the backdrop. At Futurum Group, we do a lot of research. We have our own data and intelligence sets as well. And one of the observations that had come out of your previous reports and into your future reports matches pretty closely with what we're seeing. And that's obviously the exponential rise in data. Now, I'll be candid. I think you'd probably agree with me, Steve. I don't think we need to do research to know data is growing. I think if you just look at the workloads and the demand for data, we probably can tell somewhat straightforward that the growth of data is substantial, but it's getting exponential. And in fact, AI probably has been one of the biggest drivers. I'd love to talk about what you're seeing in terms of the role that AI is playing in data growth, and in particular in the growth of data related to being able to uh, build a meaningful cyber resilience strategy.
There's a ton there. We could have an entire conference on just that topic. So I love that question. What I'd say is the first thing is how AI contributed to where we're at today. One of the things as we went back and looked at how did we get to our current state, and you're absolutely right. I don't know a credible research element which is not saying data is growing exponentially. We're just in essence arguing over exact numbers and edge cases. We all agree on the directionality and the speed. So one of the things that we've been asked quite a bit is how did we get here? And that's not exclusively because of AI, but AI is a good example of we're looking for these capabilities in a modern enterprise, and they're completely reliant on massive data sets. There is no AI without big data. There's just not. And then conversely, you really can't understand and utilize big data without AI. These things have become intrinsically linked. So AI is part of how we got here. It's one of several types of data sets that have really grown dramatically. But I think of all of those data sets, IoT, wearables is a good example, AI is going to be uniquely suited as we move forward to help us be much more resilient, to help us understand what we're doing and what we need and what we don't, and really get after a bunch of those things.
So, with this in mind, though, and apologies, one of my best traits and worst behaviors as a moderator and as an analyst is I ask questions that have 17 parts. So one of the parts
You're
where
preaching to the choir. I'm multi-part Steve.
that's good. So I had a part that I want to make sure you double click on here, though. The relationship with this exponential data and AI to what you're trying to do in data protection, cyber resiliency. You know, the proliferation of AI, of digital transformation, of big data, of data platforms, of by the way, of threats is way faster than ever. But resources haven't necessarily scaled at that same exponential rate. So can companies keep up? Are they keeping up in terms of what you're seeing at Rubrik Zero Labs in terms of dealing with data protection and cyber resiliency?
The analogy I would give as part of that answer is 7x versus 7%. And what I mean by that is we're seeing data growth at 7x within 5 years. An organization's data is going to increase sevenfold in the next 5 years based on this exponential growth we're talking about. If we now pivot to analyze data security and its posture, it's one of the things that we do at Rubrik, and we look at it objectively to measure larger trends. That data security score that we assign, and it's done by the machines, it's not a questionnaire, it's not people talking, it's an actual objective measure of environments, that's only going to increase by 7% in the next 5 years. So we're talking 7x on one hand, and then a very incremental 7% increase in data security. So I think the short answer is no. We are not heading in a direction where the growth and the efforts to secure it are going to line up, which I think leads to why we're going to absolutely need technologies like AI, in particular generative AI. That technology is well suited to go through very large data sets, understand key trends, understand what's being used, what isn't, what's critical, what may not be as critical, and help prioritize those things when we're going to have not as many resources as we want, not as much budget as we want, and far more data to control than we want. So technologies exactly like AI are going to be, we're either going to use it to get out of this or we're going to stay in this situation. I think it's going to become just that simple.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And by the way, I love that analogy. There was one I used to use on the customer experience side. I called it the 88 rule. You said the 77, I did the 88. And it was that 80% of companies believe that their products are truly differentiated, but only 8% of consumers or customers did. These are the kind of what I always call it's the gap. Mind the gap. If you've ever been to the UK, mind the gap.
Yep.
The gap is often in terms of when we live inside these vacuums. Well, security is a big vacuum at times, and you know, the people that are fighting the fight on the front really do tend to understand this stuff. The people approving the budgets and in the boardroom often kind of look at it more like an insurance policy, like, hey, what's the least we can possibly spend to to be secure? And as we know, it's really not an if you're going to deal with security or a breach, it's when. So it's kind of funny that we're still having this conflict at times. But listen, I guess it's until you've seen the impact firsthand. It's like when it was like when your dad tells you to do something, or your mom, and then you had to mess it up first. You had to touch the stove before you actually
Yeah.
realize, like, maybe I'm not going to touch the burner again. That seems to be a lot of companies' strategies with cyber. It's like, well, wait till it's completely broken, or until they get ransomware or something like that. Hopefully, what you're doing in Rubrik Zero Labs can help with this. You know, by the way, it's also a data visibility challenge. So you can have the tools, you can have the technology, you can have, but I think it was in your data itself. You said 98% of the external organizations believe they currently have significant data visibility challenges. So we talked about exponential data. I'm guessing that's the root cause, the exponential nature of data, the disparate destinations and where it exists. But I'd love to get your take, Steve, on how you are advising organizations, or at least what you're seeing organizations do successfully to improve visibility.
So I think there's a few things. I think the first is understanding how visibility relates to decision making. And I know that's not a technology. I know that's a very base answer, but it's true. You'll make as good of a decision as informed as you are. I come out of the service, I come out of the US intelligence community, where those are vital things. You want to be as empowered and informed before a decision as possible. And I think in the private sector, in all things what we used to consider IT, we're learning those. We're learning how to leverage that capability. So when we talk about how to actually improve it, I think the very first test is, does your visibility match all aspects of your hybrid environment? And I say hybrid environment fairly confidently. And I think that's one of the first challenges. We tend to think and talk about an organization as having an environment. That's just not true anymore. And we can argue if it was ever true, but it's not today. Organizations have a mix of on-premises environments, plural. We talk about cloud, but we actually probably mean multiple clouds per organization. And then we've got all these SaaS applications that we're using more and more and more in our businesses and our operations. So the first question we always ask is, can you see across all three of those elements of your hybrid environment? And then can you bring that visibility together? And I made that sound really easy, and it's not. It's actually technically very challenging. But that's the first step. Have the same level of visibility across all of the places you're operationalizing data.
Yeah. And so I'll give you a little bit more on that, by the way. Digital, transformation, kind of a buzzword, right? You'd agree with this, but we've studied this extensively. I've written 7 books about it and AI and human machines, as well as transformation. And what I'll tell you is we found that the technology is rarely the cause of failed transformation efforts. So when you kind of gave an example and you said it sounds maybe not the most technical, most transformation failures actually come from its people and its processes. It's actually not the technology. So people love the people process technology, but the tech is the thing that tends to be the most stable in terms of those 3 things. And this is extensive research on our end that has actually found this. So let me ask you this. Most companies, I think in your survey, more than half, had material losses in 2022, data losses. I think it was more than half. I mean, it seems unsustainable. I mean, what does that mean? What does that mean for everybody else if our data is constantly in a state of insecurity?
I think it means three distinct things. The first is when we talk about that question, we one of the things that we do at Rubrik Zero Labs is we try really hard to interweave different data sets to give a more cohesive view. So we use rubric telemetry, which anytime you use your own data that you're creating as an entity, you've got data bias. So we intentionally worked with 1,600 organizations that were not rubric clients. We wanted that absolute different worldview from the one that we have. And that's where that 98% comes from. We asked those 1,600 organizations, and most of those were senior leaders. Half of those were CIOs, CISOs by position, and the other half were one level down below that, the VPs and senior directors that report into them. So we asked them, how many of you lost sensitive data last year? And we use that material loss because it has a actual legal meaning. It means, was it a regulatory or framework data affected? And 53%, so just over half, said that they had a material loss of sensitive data last year. First thing that means, we're talking about senior leaders. So we're not talking about something small. We're not talking about you're a sysadmin and someone talked to you about an email that went somewhere. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of data loss a CIO and a CISO was aware of. So that's part number one. Part number two, there was almost no specific type of affected data that became more dominant. It was a mix of PCI and healthcare and HIPAA. You name a data categorization, and we saw them all about equal. And we go through those in the report. I won't beat the drum on which of those because they're all about the same. So I think that tells us all data is facing about the same level of risk. And then the third thing is, and I think this is probably the most important, we often talk about loss of data in the context of hacking events, especially in my background. I come from threat intelligence, event response. That's the space I've spent my career in. But as we ask these leaders, what's leading to this? It's a mix. It's ransomware, it's espionage hacking, it's production outages. We have machine failures that then open up data to exposure. We have misconfigurations in deployments. We have malicious insiders. We have accidental insiders. So, what I think when we put all that together, those 3 points, what we're saying is we have too much data with too many ways that it's being leaked, and that leads to too much risk. That's a problem we can start getting our arms around once we understand the scope and scale of that.
Yeah, you bring up some very good points. And in conversations that I'm having, talking to boards, CEOs, um, risk management is huge. You heard me before say kind of this continuum of as little as we need to, like how much insurance do we have to buy, all the way to one breach in our entire our entire company's longevity is now at stake. And I think the slant of the scale is moving more to the right, meaning that longevity, meaning once, there's no real way to get back trust. And there's been endless studies, as you've probably seen from peer companies and industry analysts and firms that have basically shown the everlasting impact of a breach on customer trust, on relationships, on total customer lifetime value, things like that. At the same time, though, like you said, smaller than necessary growth of investment. What does your survey kind of indicate about managing risk? Does it indicate that the challenge is well understood, and is it just a financial thing, or what is it saying?
So I think if we combine those data points we got from those external organizations, the rubric telemetry, I would even go back to the previous two reports. And I don't think anything I'm going to say would be out of line with your own organization's research or any of these other great cybersecurity organizations out there. I think it really comes down to, and again, I'll make it overly basic. I think we have the wrong framework, especially when we're talking about risk, which is the right idea. We've been, and I'll speak for myself. I mean, having been in this business for over 20 years, it's been about preventing all the breaches. It's been about securing everything. It's the castle mentality that we've all largely agreed isn't holding up. You know, that building a bigger wall, a deeper moat, it's not working. And everyone's heard all those analogies. But the one I would offer up, and what I think the research in this report really squarely tells us is it's the wrong analogy. We should be thinking about defending caravans versus castles. And the reason I say a caravan is you start making radically different decisions. You don't have to secure everything. There's no convoy or caravan that the plan has ever been everything that leaves point A and goes to point B has to get there. That's not how it works. You're going to have breakdowns. If you're in a combat situation, you're going to have attacks. There's going to be you're going to run out of gas. There's a million things that go wrong, and you prepare for those. The other part is, and I think this is a great touch point back to your core question, when you have to physically move stuff, you start paying attention to how much you're moving. And we think about that from a data perspective, we are almost undoubtedly carrying too much weight. And that doesn't matter when you're in a castle because you just put it all in storage. But when you've got to move it, when you got to load it on your back or put it in a vehicle and pack it up, you start figuring out pretty quickly, I need this, I don't need that. Do I need 17 water bottles? Probably not. I probably only need one or two. And you start running through these decisions and you start building a much more resilient operation. You can't defend everything. We've got to stop trying. And I think data is a perfect example. All data is not created equal. We do not care about all data to the same level. And I think when we stop thinking about securing a castle and start thinking about how we defend the most critical assets in transit, all of those points start becoming much more obvious than we've to this date let them be.
So, first of all, thank you for all this, Steve. It's great to get your insights, both as a former practitioner and now as someone leading this research. But I do want to sort of ask maybe two more questions. The first is going to be really about the how. How do you now, with all this knowledge, with your own experience, with the data at your disposal, how are you recommending companies, organizations to really invest and move forward in a way that's sustainable, that's, let's call it relatively affordable? What are the steps to put them on the path? What recommendations do you make to these leaders to stay on the path?
Yeah, I'd give three distinct recommendations. First, and this one will be short because we already discussed it, is visibility. Spend and pay attention to visibility because that's going to have demonstrable impacts when you need it the most. Any crisis scenario, hacking, disaster, you name it, that visibility is going to pay off in exponential ways. So visibility, number one. Number two, I think controlled growth in paying attention to that, not to go right back to the visibility, but it is part of that. Understanding and growing according to a plan. One of the things we talk about in this report is hybrid environments and how they're changing. Cloud is going to overtake on premises for the dominant part of a hybrid environment. That's going to happen. Hybrid is still going to include on premises. SaaS in 5 years is going to look like cloud does today. So let's be more intentional about how we're growing in those areas so we can control spend. We can make sure we're investing in the right areas. We can take security tools that we're used to on premises and make sure they apply to cloud and SaaS. I mean, these very intentional decisions versus just, let's just keep doing what we're doing. We'll spin up more AWS buckets or another Azure instance and we'll figure it out later. We've got to get ahead of that. And then the third part is democratizing security. And what I really mean by that is senior leaders other than the CISO have distinct decision points and own different parts of risk. I'll go back to your question around the material loss of data. That material loss assessment should not be done by the CISO. That's a legal decision. That's a governance and compliance decision. So, what is a material loss of data? By mere definition, has to include the CISO and likely your chief legal officer. So by bringing in more of the existing talent, you're bringing in more resources, more capability, and now you can really start moving quicker. And so we really focus on those three things: visibility, be intentional on your growth, and democratize security.
I love it. So with a little bit of time we have left, I'd love to just get a little more on what you plan to do in the Rubrik Zero Lab, and how you plan to continue to evolve. I obviously everyone wants to hear about the data and your reports and your research and threats. What's next for you?
So the first thing we want to do is we want to stress test these findings. One of the things that we've been, frankly, fairly lucky to have the leadership buy-in and the larger community buy-in has been data security is fairly opaque as a topic. So each of these reports we really try to stress test with our own organizations, with external organizations, working groups. We want to know how does this match the realities other organizations see, and then adjust where there's disparities and close deltas. That'll be the first thing we'll do. Second thing we want to do is we want to keep on this progression of drilling down farther. We want to keep taking things one more step deeper. And so, what we'd like to work on next is how do we look at specific threats against specific types of data? And again, where is that going? And the last thing we're pretty excited to do is really continue working with more and more partner organizations and other organizations. As an example, our last report, we worked with 4 other cybersecurity organizations to round out the data set. This one is just Rubrik and then these external organizations. But now we want to figure out how do we take our view and combine that with other organizations that are working on the same overall threat landscape, but from different perspectives, and start building a more cohesive picture for everybody. I just think that all hands on deck and all experts giving their particular slice of the pie is going to make it better for everyone else.
I think that's a great way to end this. And I really do appreciate, Steve, you spending some time and walking through what you're doing there at Rubrik Zero Labs. It's been really uh, a challenging time for the industry. And with so much growth in data, the threats have been palpable. Having said that, you know, it's also a competitive differentiation. It's a competitive advantage if you can stay in front of it, if you can keep your company and the data that you run your business on safe. And it's business technology and people like you that are helping to make this possible. So thanks so much for making time and spending some time with me here today.
Well, thank you, Daniel. This has been great. Really appreciate it.
What a great discussion to get us started, really laid the groundwork for us. Now, so for this next session, Stephen is going to be leading a discussion on how top cybersecurity experts predict threats and navigate risk. And joining Stephen are Sandra Joyce, Vice President of Mandiant Intelligence for Google Cloud, and Larry Zelvin, Executive Vice President and Head of the Financial Crimes Unit at BMO Financial Group. So turn things over to Stephen to get this discussion going.
Well, everyone, thanks for joining us for our second session here. This one's near and dear to my heart as it's the part of this work that I've spent the most of my career in. And I've got someone that I've spoken with several times with Zero Labs before, and also is a former boss and a current mentor of mine, in Sandra Joyce, the Vice President of Mandiant Intelligence as part of Google Cloud. Sandra, thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you, Steve.
And I'm also really excited to round this out with Larry Zelvin. He's the executive VP and head of the financial crimes unit at the Bank of Montreal Financial Group. Larry, thanks also for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here with you and Sandra.
So I'll just jump right into it. I'm not going to spend anyone's time here going through details of the report. I just really like to talk about how we use intelligence and how we forecast this. And for us at Rubrik Zero Labs, as we're still getting our legs underneath of us, we did something different with this report where we looked at today, we went back several years and examined how we got to today, and then we forecast forward 5 years. And that's the new piece for us. I'd be remiss if I didn't have two just absolute experts in threats and intelligence and all those things. I'd like to ask each of you, and Larry, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, I'd really be curious as you look back over your career, how have you seen cyber threats change over that time?
Yeah, no, Steve, it's been amazing. I started in cyber a little over a decade ago. My background is not actually technology. It's not actually cyber. I'm a retired U.S. naval officer, an aviator by background, work security, everything from 9/11 all the way up through Katrina and other things. And I got into cyber from more of a crisis management background. So I've been a consumer of intelligence for many decades in the U.S. government at the most senior levels. I actually have a master's degree in intelligence along my military career. And I'll quote somebody I used to work for back in the Pentagon many years ago, a rather controversial figure, but I think he was right. Where he goes, there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. And you've seen that over the last 5 years. But back around 2012, if I can even go back even further, there were DDoS attacks that really impacted the U.S. service providers, AT&T, Verizon, among others. It was the start of the DDoS attacks against the financial sector that lasted about 9 months. It was the Qassam fighters. And those DDoS attacks 10 years ago are minuscule to what we're seeing today. I mean, almost laughable. And it almost turned over internet service providers. It absolutely impacted financial institutions for 9 months. It was a very difficult attack. But when you look at the attacks of today, it's just ridiculous. The malware attacks. I mean, back a few years ago, the biggest thing we were worried about was the loss of personal identifiable information, sensitive information. Now we're seeing attacks like ransomware that are hitting critical infrastructure, that are impacting the ability to deliver energy in the United States. If you just think of what happened to Colonial Pipeline, you're seeing blended attacks that are impacting solar winds, and then from there are impacting thousands of others. So it's becoming far more complicated. It's becoming far more intense. And it's also being used, I think, early on, and there was hacktivists, all right? There were folks that were just kind of testing, but now cyber attacks are really becoming instruments of national power in the way that armies and navies used to be. So those are really the fundamental changes that I see, that it's gone from things that were rather overwhelming early on, but with limited purpose, to things that are really becoming overwhelming with purposes that are actually affecting the transactions between nations. But Sandra, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. There have been monumental shifts since the beginning. I started out my intelligence career at Goodfellow Air Force Base when it was everything that was important was classified, right? And now all of a sudden we've seen the normalization of commercial cyber and threat intelligence, characterizing threats for nation states and cyber criminals in a way that was only, I would say, an inherent government function not 5, 7 years ago. And this shift has happened because of the nature of threats in the cyber domain. They are, out there for those of us with the skills and tools to see them. And we can track nation state activity over years now in a way that simply wasn't the case before. And what we're seeing is exactly what my colleague described. We're seeing things that have gone from nuisance to major national and international consequences. When we look at the evolution of things like ransomware, where it started out with, a few thousand Bitcoin when Bitcoin wasn't worth very much, to now, demands for $30 million. We're seeing threat actors becoming increasingly aggressive, making threats, taking very personal and aggressive tactics to urge and compel victims to make payments. So in this, we're seeing, also the rise of sort of the rest of the world and their cyber capabilities, whereas before it was isolated to some, small time hacktivists and nation states doing nation state things. Now we're seeing very advanced skills from cyber criminals who are exploiting 0 days in the wild. They're doing a lot of things that we kind of attributed only to nation states before. And even nation states, it's not just the big four anymore. We're seeing cyber threat activity from, more minor players making some pretty interesting things happen in the cyber domain. So yeah, I agree. Things are getting more complex. Things are getting more aggressive, and defenders are having to really evolve here in this space.
I just could not agree more with what each of you said, and I think it's really interesting. I would love to say we scheduled this way, but I think for the first time ever, I'm on one of these panels, and I'm not atypical. All of us came out of the military. None of us worked cyber first,
Mhm.
so it's pretty neat to see how we've all ended up here. So let me kind of pivot to a little more forward looking, and I'll definitely ask you this one first, Sandra, because I know this is something near and dear to your heart as you teach this, as well as have to do this on behalf of Google Cloud. And then Larry, for you running all things threat and on the cybercrime side for one of the largest financial organizations in the Americas. It's one thing to talk about predicting threats. It's another thing to convert that to a boardroom and the C-suite. In each of your experiences, and Sandra, I'd love to hear, your experience on this to start. What works well when predicting future cyber threats to individuals that don't come out of the space that the three of us have?
Well, one thing to think about is that a lot of people use the words like predict and like it's a crystal ball, and obviously nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. But what threat intelligence allows us to do is understand sort of the probabilities of things and from a risk perspective. So where are there where is there high likelihood of action, or what are the likely courses of action that are going to occur or that enemies or adversaries are going to take? That's the value proposition of intelligence, is that it can frame those things ultimately to help a decision maker take a course of action. And so, what, as an intelligence professional, what we're trying to do is really lay out the tactics, the techniques, the procedures of threat actors, what their likely courses of action are, what have they done in the past, and really paint a picture so that we can operationalize those insights. And when you can operationalize those insights, then what you're doing is you're blocking all of the possible outcomes, right? One by one, you're kind of, if a threat actor uses these techniques, well, you can run, detections on those techniques. If you know that they use these tools, well, you can look for those tools proactively. So it's really about reducing the options that threat actors can take and making them have to spend more money, making them have to work harder, find new tactics, new ways of doing things, and pushing them into an uncomfortable space so that you're imposing the cost through your insights and what threat intelligence can provide.
And Larry, how's that been on your end? You're working with financial organizations, a world apart, as you would. So, how has your experience been getting this to really convert and drive the right actions in these organizations?
Sure. I'm going to break it up into two parts. And one is like the prediction aspect, and then the other is just talking to the boards and people who don't necessarily live and breathe this every single day. So when you look at the prediction aspect of it, I think the one thing that we can say for certainty is that we can't predict the future with certainty. And that's okay, right? Because I think ultimately it's about having capabilities. And the story I often tell around capabilities is a few years ago in New York, an airliner captained by Sully Sullivan landed in the Hudson. He was able to get it in the water on a freezing day in New York, and everyone lived. It's amazing. But the city of New York, and I don't think any city, anywhere in any nation, had a plan on how to rescue people from a plane crash on a river during a winter storm. Yet New York was able to adapt. It's about capabilities. So what I talk about is the potentiality of threats, but more importantly, what capabilities do we want to have and how will we utilize those? Because again, we're never going to predict it right. We're never going to be able to understand what's going to come at us in a way that probably will be exactly the way we'll see it. So when I talk to boards, and I've done it now in two different financial firms, I really do talk about probability and more about capability and what are those threats that I'm really trying to protect us against. Personally, I look at what I say is we're going to fail, right? I have a modality of telling them that no matter what we do, it's not going to be good enough. So when it happens, how are we going to respond and how are we going to recover, right? No matter what gets thrown at us. And so I talk a lot about that and our abilities to bring our environment back and work with partners and make sure that our critical partners are able to restore. And then we'll talk about the defense in depth and hopefully how we'll prevent the folks from coming in. But you have to also do it in a non-alarmist way. Again, as security people, we live and breathe threats and risks and mitigating it. They do in the board level, but particularly in financial services, they look at it more from a financial perspective and not from a nation state, activists, criminals, terrorists, and so on. So you've got to, in my experience, explain it to them in a quantitative way where they're measuring risk and understanding risk like they do other risks, but now we're doing it in a way that is talking about security risk and probability and how they're managing it and how the investment they're making is actually delivering capabilities that they can actually understand and go, yep, that makes sense, and we should continue to invest.
Yeah. So Larry, I'm gonna, double tap on a couple of things you mentioned there. One is you talk about the only thing we can predict is that we're gonna get the predictions wrong. So I think in fairness in advertising, one of the things that we got wrong and we needed to correct in our most recent Rubrik Zero Labs report is we were wrong about how much data is growing. Our previous report, we looked at that being about 25% year over year based on what we saw in 2022. For this recent study, we went back several years and we pulled a larger data set, and we saw that data is growing at 42% versus 25%. So we're seeing, in essence, a 7x growth of data in the next 5 years for a typical organization. They'll have about 150 million more sensitive data records than they do today. And another piece of this that's been interesting as I've spent time here at Rubrik, and again, Larry, I'll pull the thread on something you just mentioned was cost and how that goes to the business. I'm used to very much being in that nation state world, that APT side of the house versus the cyber criminal side of the house. And now that I'm dealing more with data, things that people are wanting to hear about is, yeah, I want to hear about threat, but I want to understand how that goes to risk. I want to understand how that goes to cost. And one of the rare times we see that be very clear cut is this data growth. It's as much a risk and surface area to attackers as is it a business cost. And so, Larry, I'll kind of start with you, and then Sandra, I'd love to hear your perspective being at Google Cloud and talking about big data. How do you not want to know what Google has? So, Larry, I'll kind of start with, when you hear that we're seeing data grow at 42%, first part of that is, does that match what you see and your peers are talking about? And what do we do about that as defenders?
Yeah, no, it doesn't surprise me. I agree. But look, I think data fundamentally, the risk has changed over the years, in my view. And let me explain what I mean. A few years ago, I used to get letters, emails from companies, organizations, the US government in particular, stating that my information had been stolen. And I would get to these letters a year, maybe three. And then they would tell me about how they were going to have these monitoring services watch for potential breaches of my data, my information. I don't get those anymore. I don't see those anymore. It is my personal theory that pretty much all the data you could possibly steal from me has already been taken. And it's not really valuable. And if you just look at what a social security number runs for on the dark web or date of birth or those kind of personal identifiable, it's not really worth a whole lot anymore. So what I worry about with data is the ability for my organization and other critical infrastructure's ability to deliver services and goods to our customers to meet our requirements. And it's the lack of accessibility to that data, i.e., ransomware, wiper, the potentially DDoS, lack of access. Those are the things that really concern me. So when you talk about the growth of data, that my concern is actually the infrastructure where that data is housed, either on-prem or in cloud, through software as a service providers, so on and so forth, because now I have a bigger footprint to protect and a bigger footprint that I need to make sure that remains operational. But there's also obviously that sensitive data that still remains very much at high risk, particularly around transactional data in financial services. So that loss of credibility, that loss of trust is something I worry a lot about. So that's how I'm viewing the data problem. Sandra, your thoughts?
Well, I think it does concern me from a threat perspective, especially considering the focus that so many threat actors have on these types of data sets for a variety of reasons. From a nation state perspective, some actors are going after large data sets, and anyone collecting these could conceivably be a target for them. So, and then from the criminal perspective, we found that actors are looking for data that they can use to extort victims with. And so the data that you collect becomes more critical to remain unexposed. And it has that sort of increasing value to criminals. And we really have to shift our threat profiles to account for that, and potentially our security controls, because new data is being created, critical information is being created, and it's not static, right? It changes, it grows. It's not just the quantity of it, but it's what exactly is that data, and it's regardless of you know, of the size of it, it's always valuable to somebody for some reason, right? So I think that from a threat perspective, we do have to pay attention.
Yeah, and as I think about that context being so important that each of you have mentioned, I think one of the things that'd be really fascinating to hear from both of you is, what are actual realistic goals as intelligence and threat professionals? What are realistic goals we can give ourselves to help drive respective organizations and our own respective clients forward, especially in times of transformation? Sandra, would you mind taking a first swing at that one?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about this, we're really in the business of decision advantage for defenders, right? So that can be on the tactical level by enabling somebody to pursue one detection or another. It can be on the strategic level where we're enabling a security organization to develop a budget that's appropriate for the risks that are incoming that they face. But one of the amazing things that intelligence professionals can offer leaders is really to help them justify those budgets and those budget requests. So that if they need to upgrade to the latest technology, or they need to leverage intelligence to help justify those expenses. Well, that's one way that they can do that. So looking at which adversaries like to come after you, what do they have in mind, why are they targeting you, what is your threat profile, and what are they going to do if you don't make those assessments. That kind of goes to what Larry was saying before about laying out the risks to your leadership team, not just the risks of what's going to happen to you, but the risks that grow in the face of inaction. So that's one way that we can create you know a sort of a picture for our leadership and where we need to be.
And Larry, we talk about numbers. You're in a literal and figurative numbers organization. How do you put forward realistic goals that your peers and the folks above you can hold your functions accountable and help drive an organization forward?
Yeah, let me ask the first question about framing the threat, and then I'll get into the quantification of it. I mean, on defining the threat, I think I break it down into the strategic, operational, and tactical intelligence elements. Right on the strategic, understanding motivations, understanding what the threat actors are doing, nation states' ability and also desire to use cyber weapons, criminal actors, how are they doing it, and that's where I get more to the operational side. On the operational side of intelligence, I think the best information comes from victims. So being able to have access to when an attack occurs, to understand the tradecraft, understand where the vulnerabilities are, to assess your environment, to learn from others' mistakes or misfortunes, whatever they may be. And then you get those tacticals of getting those indicators, right? To go search your environment and then make sure that what is happening or has happened at someplace else is not happening or will happen at your organization. The quantification of how is it the investment that is really paying off, it's both quantitative and qualitative. And the qualitative is actually, I think, more valuable than the quantitative in cybersecurity. I also have the privilege of leading fraud at the Bank of Montreal, and that really is quantitative. I can tell you how much our losses are, how much our customers are losing, right? It really is a monetary value that we actually measure. Are we above our plan, below our plan, so forth? You don't have that in cyber, right? In cyber, you win by not losing. And so you're constantly playing for the draw. Um, but when you look at the qualitative side, I think there are things of, um, you know, what is the, for in a heavily regulated industry like finance, what is the regulatory environment? How many regulatory actions or findings do you have against you? Because that is a measure of whether or not your program is solid. The audit of your programs within internal audit and also external audit. What are their findings? How severe are they? What is your ability to deal with them? How often are they finding things? I think red teaming, purple teaming, purple dot teaming, we're getting all different colors. But I think the ability to have both internal and external penetration testing to defend against attacks, and also the ability to show that you're making progress, is another great indicator. But when you look and try and show the value of your investments, I think you've got to take a bunch of things, bring them together holistically, but it's both qualitative and quantitative. And then at the end of the day, for us, that's how we're showing the value. So it's not one thing, it's many.
I think it's really interesting how, we're all working on the same challenges and we all see them from a little bit different optics. And, as we're looking at this from Zero Labs perspective and speaking to our respective audiences, we're talking a lot about drivers in the threat landscape being the ever increasing importance of data. It's always been important. The ever increasing leverage of valid access and compromise using users. That's always been important, but that has profound implications in a cloud and a SaaS world, and that's where a lot of our hybrid environments are going. So we're speaking a lot with our audiences around these kinds of things. I would really love to put each of you in the hot seat and hear what are you talking to your respective audiences about as the main drivers in the threat landscape and what you think they need to be concerned about. Larry, would you mind speaking to that?
Sure. I mean, the thing that's obvious to me right now is the geopolitical dynamic is about as complex as I've ever seen it. Everything from the Middle East to Asia. As you go across even into Europe, there's challenges unlike we have seen in decades. That Cold War peace dividend is, for all intents and purposes, gone. So the challenge that I present is that we're not seeing the massing of armies and navies as we had in centuries past. It is highly expensive in this technical world, and also highly risky to have these massive formations attack each other on the open field or on the open seas. So you're really getting into asymmetric warfare, right? And this is something I think the United States has done incredibly well after 9/11 in the war on terrorism, is that asymmetric warfare using special operational forces. Other countries that are difficult from a Western perspective could and have been using cyber as that asymmetric means. I think they are within their individual capitals, really calculating the risk and reward of using cyber activity. I think as you look at Ukraine and Russia, they have clearly made a number of attempts to bring down Ukrainian infrastructure and capabilities using cyber. But in my view, and I'd welcome an opposing view, they haven't thrown the full force of what they could potentially do. And I think they're if they did, it could create some additional problems. I think as you look at the China to Taiwan situation, there have been intelligence reports, congressional testimony on the potential attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure, and open source reporting on Chinese probing and potential Chinese action against infrastructure like energy and transportation, particularly around military facilities. And then I am very concerned right now about Iran Supreme Leader a couple of days ago said Israel had crossed the red line. We don't know what that means for the Iranians, but the Iranians have demonstrated time and time again they have extraordinary cyber capabilities, and they could utilize them not only against Israel, but also against the allies of Israel. The last thing I'll mention is what I'm really concerned is we've seen this before, is that these cyber weapons are not precise. They can get out of control. They can inflict damage that was unintended. So that's another concern is that although my bank may not have been the intended target because of a potential software or vulnerability that's exploiting, the weapon that was chosen was directed at one group, but then has potential global implications that we all need to deal with. Sandra?
Yeah, I agree. So one sort of adage we always live under at Mandiant is that geopolitics drives cyber activity. And I couldn't agree more that what the situation that we're seeing is sort of increased tension between the US and China is driving a lot of the cyber espionage and other activity from China. We're seeing the placement and prepositioning of Chinese threat actors in critical infrastructure. We're while we haven't seen destructive or disruptive, activity hardly at all from China, it doesn't mean they don't have the ability to do it, right, or the positioning. While we have seen the capability and intent from, Russia, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran in this space, and so I think that we're clearly geopolitics is having an effect in the threat landscape, and even criminal activity is probably benefiting from the situation in Ukraine's, right? So other than the situation in the Middle East, the changing situation in Asia Pacific is going to continue to keep us busy. I think probably the other major driver in the market is the market mechanisms behind the criminal underground. So we know that ransomware is a very lucrative marketplace. And when operators are conducting, their ransomware campaigns or other extortion activities, they're doing it from areas of safe harbor, where those host nations are not interested in stopping those activities. They provide, if anything, tacit consent or even more, more support. So until those geopolitical issues are solved, the cyber threat landscape continues to be very active, and the United States bears the brunt of those activities. And so I think that when we think about the trends and topics that we talk about as drivers for the future threat landscape, I think that geopolitics really underpins all of the things that are going on right now. When you think about, we sort of in a funny way, but it was sort of gallows humor. We called this summer 0-day summer because of all of the 0 days that were being announced as exploited in the wild. And many of those came from, China sponsored or China Nexus groups. And we're almost at 80 0 days exploited in the wild from our count that year to date. And that is already surpassing last year. It's approaching a record number from 2021. We fully expect that to surpass it and to be a record year this year. And when we think about of those that we have attributed, like I said, most of them are from China, but some are also from cyber criminal groups who are getting more and more, sophisticated. And when we see from the Move It campaign, that was Fin 11, and Klopp already announced something like over 120 victims from that, and that's a number is continuing to grow even now. So if cyber threat criminals are exploiting 0 days in the wild, if that's going to be sort of a new norm, if we're getting into that space where that's 0 days are not just a nation state game, then I think that we have crossed into a very complex cyber threat landscape that's really pushed by the geopolitical events that we're seeing.
Sandra, you mentioned market forces, and I think we all immediately think about, how bad guys are doing SaaS things just like we are. I mean, ransomware as a service is literally SaaS, but with ransomware, and it has all the same benefits that SaaS does for us. One of the other market pieces I'll bring up is AI, and there's no scenario the three of us are going to be in a call and not have to answer the AI question. I know both of you have had to speak about this topic at length. So what I would kind of like to do is just ask each of you, where do you think AI is going in the threat landscape? That could be good side, that could be bad side. I'll kind of leave it open because I'll be at least honest on my side. I don't know. I have lots of thoughts and very few assessments on where AI, in particular generative AI, is going. So more than anything, I'll probably use this as an opportunity to get your answers so I can copy them and steal them. Sandra, if you don't mind going first, give me your answers. I'd love that.
I would happy to give you my answer, Steve. So, I actually asked this question to the several hundred researchers that work for me, and I said, let's take this AI conversation out from the hypothetical, from the Hollywood and everything, and let's talk real world stuff. So, what is the threat actor doing today in the threat landscape using AI? And the answer was, they were using it for things like fabricating images from a generative AI perspective, use, video and text, doing information operations. That's really where the bulk of the activity is that we've seen. But in terms of outcomes, we haven't seen a lot that's really moved the needle in that space. So it's not for lack of trying, though. A lot of the information operations, are plentiful, but hard to say that they've actually gotten a lot of wins out of it. The other thing that we've been seeing is in the underground marketplaces, we've watched threat actors advertise sort of jailbreak versions of some of the more popular chat bots and LLMs that are out there, claiming that they could skirt the restrictions on there. For the low price of $199.99 a month, you'll be able to get access to something like that. Now, these are criminals. We don't know to what extent they're lying or they're being truthful. But I think that it's fair to say that right now, that criminals are actually experimenting with AI. They haven't really gotten to the place where I would say they are taking this to a new level of threat yet, right? Another piece of evidence is we respond to about 1,000 incident breaches a year, and not a single one of those has shown any real AI demonstration of any AI capability. So we haven't seen AI being used in a way that is truly concerning yet. And I say yet pretty, specifically because we know criminals will get better in this space. So that's what the bad guys are doing. That's what red team is doing. When we think about what blue team is doing, I'm pretty optimistic because we ran a hackathon at Google a couple months ago, and I asked Google engineers if they would please show us what they could do to help us using LLMs, using SecPom2. What could they do to help our workflows? We had 44 teams respond with various incredible things that they could do. We could, reverse malware faster, write YARA rules faster. We could look for anomalies and all of this alerts. And that's what these LLMs are really, really good at is translating those things and really 10xing the ability of each of the researchers to do the work that they're doing. So I think right now we have this opportunity where threat actors are still experimenting. It's still in a very nascent phase for them. They don't have the benefit of having the product direction, the massive investment, the LLMs at their fingertips. That's not what they've got. They're kind of on the periphery for now. So we have this opportunity, I think defenders have it, to really leapfrog over them and try to make an impact. And so if people haven't embraced it yet, from a defender perspective, I think this is our opportunity and we really need to do it.
What do you think, Larry? You're from an industry that's very comfortable with AI. I'm curious to hear your thoughts around that.
Sure. I realize we're almost at time, so I'll give it kind of in short sound bites. A couple random thoughts first. The genie's out of the bottle. AI is here to stay, and it's not going anywhere, and I think that's a good thing. When it comes to AI, I think it is early days. I think that we're going to continue to develop this over time, and then the challenges will come, but so will some solutions. The thing that is most on my mind is the ability of AI to take a rather unsophisticated malicious actor, give them the ability to become sophisticated in a time frame far faster than they could without AI. I'm concerned about their ability to generate attacks in a way that is going to outpace our way to actually manage them. But I think my concluding thought when you talk about AI is I think the best way that we're only going to be able to manage AI threats is with defensive AI. So it's going to be a bit of a chess game, AI versus AI, because humans are not going to be able to keep up at the speed in which these things are going to be coming at us. So I really look forward to seeing what the marketplace brings and where we all go. And hopefully it gets there before the bad guys do.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where we go. And I appreciate both your answers. I've got lots of good things I can cut and copy and use as my answers now. So I appreciate the bonus material there. I just want to say again, starting or ending where we started with a genuine appreciation of both of you and the work that you do and for joining us here on this session. Thank you for the time today. It means a lot.
Oh, thank
you.
Really appreciate being here.
What a fascinating discussion. And that sets us up for our third segment of the day. Stephen's going to be having a fireside chat with two CISOs about how they navigate uncertainty. And so joining Stephen for this discussion are Aaron Hughes, who's Senior Vice President and CISO for Albertsons, and Amit Agarwal, who's former head of cybersecurity for Moderna.
All right, everyone, thank you back to our third session as we talk about Rubrik Zero Labs' report of securing an uncertain future. I'm incredibly excited for this session for a couple of reasons. The first is we have two actual experts in how we secure an uncertain future, and Aaron Hughes, Senior Vice President and CISO of Albertsons, and Amit Agarwal, the former head of security at Moderna. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The
Thank
other
you for
reason
having us.
The other reason I'm really excited for this is one thing we've done at Rubrik Zero Labs is we've actually worked with our CISO advisory board on this type of study. We've met with them twice. Our first report that we did, we spoke briefly about the trends and ideas. Our second Rubrik Zero Labs report, we actually went through a full after action with our CISO advisory board, and they gave us some really significant feedback on how to think about things from a CIO and CISO perspective. And then this third report, we've actually worked with them before it, and now as we roll it out and get their actual ground truth perspective on this. So with that, I'm just going to dive right into it. What I'd really like to start with Aaron and Amit, both of you. Aaron, I'll probably start with asking you first. One of the things that jumped out as we talked with the external organizations, those 1,600 organizations led by CIOs and CISOs, and they talked about in the last year, they endured a material loss of critical data. That could be from ransomware, that could be from production outages, malicious insiders, malicious code, also just misconfigurations, the whole gamut. But half of those organizations to 53% lost critical data last year, and 1 out of 6 reported multiple losses of material data. So what I'd like to really do is kind of stress test that first. That number jumps out. Aaron, I'll kind of ask you first. Does that match what you see when you discuss with your peers on this topic?
Yeah, I was certainly intrigued by that statistic, and I think what piqued most of my interest was the characterization that the data loss was material. It's probably not the direction you want to take the question, but like as I talked to CISO peers, like the characterization of a material loss is something you certainly want to lean heavily on your legal partners, your outside counsel, and not as a tech organization CIOs or CISOs characterizing something as material. Now, presuming that that happened in these situations for 53% of the respondents, I do find that number to be incredibly large because we haven't seen like that uptick in filings with the SEC, right? The 8Ks that would be associated with some sort of
Yep.
material event. I don't discount that there has been like loss of data, access to systems of 53% of the respondents, but like the fact that it was characterized was material, we either have sort of underreporting for the public companies in the sort of survey, or I would say it's a much larger issue than I would have imagined. I wouldn't have thought that 53% would have characterized it as material, but is my initial reaction to the statistic there.
And Amit, how does that match what you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, I think I am not surprised to see that data. I mean, I think everybody had some sort of a data breach to an extent. So I think I agree. And in fact, I am very impressed with the quality of this report. I mean, I think it was great data to present to the audit committee and to the boards. I was, there was some really great stats. I think one especially noteworthy for me was that 145% growth in the SaaS data. I think that is so relevant, and I feel that that's kind of makes our job so much more difficult, right? Preventing data breach in a SaaS environment is extremely difficult now. So that's kind of make it even more interesting to, like, how you can do deep integrations with security platforms like Rubrik or any other out there, like, and how you can continuous monitoring with insights and data analytics in terms of what is happening real time in the environment to kind of prevent data breach. I think that's kind of really very interesting. So I mean, you go to your board and say that, this is what the trends are, this is why you need the investments. I think a great report, and I don't disagree with any of that data that you have published. So very good. Keep up the good work.
Well, we
I would,
appreciate it.
I
Oh,
would
go
I
ahead,
would add
Aaron.
on to that certainly, regardless if it's 53% or if it's 23%, like there's still an incredibly challenging environment where data security is top of mind for sort of all technology leaders. I wouldn't argue with that point. I think my issue was the materiality of that data loss. That was just alarming to me and just not something I would have characterized just from talking to my peer group. That would have been over half of the respondents had a material event.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
so
that's a
each
good
of you
point. Yeah.
mentioned something I'd love to pull the thread on a little bit. Let me start with Amit and the data growth, and the Aaron. I definitely want to circle back to the peer group, and you mentioned legal in particular. Where I definitely have something I'd like to speak about that. So, kind of focus on the data growth. That's one of the things that, honestly, as we especially engage with the CISO advisory board on our previous report, and we talked about things that were important to leaders, and our CISO advisory board, both of you highlighted our previous assessment that data was growing 25% year over year. As we expanded that data set, as we look back further, we actually had to correct our findings. We're seeing it's 42% if we encounter more than just 2022. And Amit, you mentioned that 145% SaaS data growth, clouds growing about 70%, and then we've got on premises growing right around 20%. One of the things I've seen in my previous experience working breaches is it's hard to secure anything that's growing and moving. And we used to look at that from an asset perspective, like 8, 9, 10%, actual physical asset growth. The data growth gives me pause as a network defender. I'm just not sure how we can even prepare to secure something that's growing at over 40% in a single year, and what that means. I'd really like to get both of your perspectives on that. Amit, you kind of raised it, so I'll give you first swing. How are CISOs supposed to secure an environment that's growing at more than 40% a year from a data perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and I'm sure everybody is thinking about it. I would I would not worry too much about the growth percentage, because I guess that's happening and everybody understands that there's more and more data, right? But w- there's no replacement for getting basics right. That's the first thing that you need to do, right? Multi-factor authentication, least privilege access, data resilience, continuous monitoring with risk insights. Everybody has to do it now. I think good thing is, like, what works in our favor now is, like, there are companies like Rubrik that can help you set up the infrastructure and provide these built-in data protection and governance capabilities, right? I mean, Rubrik is just one example. There are others as well, right? There's ton of investments done out there. You just kind of go and leverage that, right? What you really need to do is, your business better than anyone, right? So I mean, all organizations, in my point, is, need to understand where your data is and what data is important for your business. I think, and that's kind of like, it's surprisingly that majority of the companies don't understand that. They don't know where the data is and like what data is important for them. So once you do that and define the rules around that data, I think most of your job is done. And then I think and then there is, like, these platforms that you can actually leverage to kind of, really go and secure your data and manage that effectively. Is it easy? I don't think so. But I think, the heavy lift is you as a business working with your stakeholders, in every different business unit needs to be involved, and then kind of go and use the platforms to kind of protect that. And that's kind of really how I see it. I mean, it's not going to be easy, and especially like SaaS providers, so that continuous monitoring and having an automatic response to kind of prevent those exfiltration and breach is going to be the most challenging piece. So I'll take a pause there.
And what about you, Aaron? How does that affect what you do as a CISO?
So I agree totally with Amit that the growth of data is not slowing down, right? Like every company has the buzzwords around digital transformation, digital enablement. We're creating more data, we're accessing more customers, both corporate data, customer data. That trend is not stopping. Also, would key in on the point that while security teams will provide the capabilities and tooling to support that, or to govern or support that bloat, there's got to be partnership with legal on the retention of data. Like, when can we eliminate data from the ecosystem? There's got to be partnerships if you're in an organization large enough to have a chief data officer that can help assist with the governance and classification and stewardship of the data, such that it is not growing unfettered, unmanaged across the ecosystem. That's where it becomes incredibly hard for the security teams to secure data that is not well classified or characterized. Right? Is it company confidential, proprietary, something that you want to make sure doesn't leave the virtual walls of the company? Sort of where it is. Is it local storage on a laptop? Is it in a SaaS provider? Is it some on-prem data storage? Um, Again, I know that speaks to a lot of maturity in some programs around data governance, but like the tooling is there, as we've heard, to help secure. It's more of like the framework and governance around how to
Exactly.
manage it. And that's where
Yeah.
I'm really leaning heavily on my partners in legal and in our data governance organization, so that we aren't retaining data, excuse me, that's 40 years old, and that we have it in a sort of well-managed state, so that once it is tagged, we know how to secure it.
Yeah, and Aaron, you've
100%
mentioned,
agree.
legal. You just mentioned governance, chief data officer, and that gives me just a perfect alley right back to the question I wanted to ask from the very first discussion, where you
Mhm.
mentioned the materiality assessment. So one of the things that we've heard from the CISO advisory board, and we talk about in the study, and we've had other conversations around, is this idea of democratizing security, bringing in other leaders other than just the CISO and the CISO's teams when it comes to security. And we see that a lot with data security. The CISO doesn't necessarily own all the levers for data or anything around it. So, Aaron, I'll kind of start with you, and Amit, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. That's easy for me as a
Mhm.
threat person to write into paper. That's easy for me to give as a recommendation. What's the reality of doing that, though, in a long term organization where everyone's working together and balancing a million priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a good 25 to 30% of a CISO's job nowadays is engaging other business leaders, influencing, sort of espousing like the imperative around, I know it's a bit cliche, but like security is everybody's responsibility. Security teams can deploy the tooling, but if you've got mismanaged practices, shared passwords, lack of adoption to MFA, like all the things that you've heard many times at conferences, like security will fail. Now, specific to the data security challenges, and again, I know it's unique based on the size and market of the company, but a lot of companies have created privacy teams under legal where a lot of the policies around data retention are owned, and to the degree that we again aren't maintaining long lineage of data. And then on the governance side, like as long as the security team has a north star for how data is being governed and tagged, that's also just a key partnership to better enable the program. Now, at the end of the day, like rubber meets the road, the CEO and the board are going to look to the CISO to own the data security program, but that is only successful with the business relationships I laid out. And it really is, again, incumbent on the CISO to, manage that peer group to, help make sure it's a team effort on that.
And Amit, I'm curious your experience. I mean, even just in your previous role at Moderna, that's a highly regulated space with lots of other requirements. How do you bring in your requirements and the things that you see in your experience on the security side and bring in other leaders to help solve these problems?
Yeah, I wish I could add anything more than what Aaron said. I mean, spot on, 100% agree. I think I had the exact same experience there. I think just if I may just quickly just touching on your last point, I mean, regulated environment. So that makes it a bit more challenging, for a company like Moderna and any other life science because, there's a lot happening in the manufacturing space and, the FDA and all the compliance that we need to have there. So typically what you will see is that there's like a lot of the, compliance being managed out of the manufacturing organization, and that's kind of where the partnership with the CISO team is extremely important. And I think that's kind of which is unique for the big pharma and on the life science companies. And I think that's kind of it's a bit of a challenge where how do you make sure that you don't go to an extreme and you have a one systematic approach towards everything that you do in the organization. And sometimes you will see that GXP is much more advanced than the traditional corporate security. So I think to bring that balance is a bit of a challenge. But as Aaron said, data security is overall a CISO responsibility, with budget being kind of still in the CISO's purview. But then you're working with all other business units to make sure that you're managing that. It's not easy, I think, given all the different priorities and how people want to work. I think it is really challenging, but that's kind of what your job is. I mean, and that's kind of really where, to Aaron's point, like most of your CISO time and effort should be to kind of bring the organization into alignment. So,
Well, I appreciate that from both of you. I think one of the things that's probably surprising me on this session alone is that we haven't talked about AI yet. I don't think there's any chance where three senior leaders in security can sit down and talk about anything without talking about the AI police showing up and making sure we ask that. So, one of the things we actually didn't focus on artificial intelligence much in this study. The only real way it came up was as we went back and looked at some of the reasons why we're seeing such data growth, this data explosion. AI is a piece of that. You need lots of data to create AI models, and you need AI to move through big data. So we really kind of looked at it as part of how we got here. What I'm really interested in is what's AI mean for us moving forward. So I'd kind of like to split the AI question in half and say, Amit, would you mind talking about what you think AI is going to do used against us? And maybe Aaron, how do you think on the security side, as defenders and sustainers, what should we be doing with AI moving forward? So let me kind of start with the bad news. Amit, what do you see AI being leveraged against us from an offensive
oh,
perspective, from an attacker perspective?
Absolutely. I think there's nobody out there who's going to disagree with that. I think 100%, right? So as we use more and more, people will try to figure out like how you can exploit that. There are going to be bad actors using adversarial AI. My worry is, like most of the people who are going to use artificial intelligence, they probably don't understand, the algorithms and the math behind it, right? Those artificial intelligence models. And it is fairly easy to poison those models, right? I mean, and especially when you are relying more on those foundational models more and more, right? So if you have a bad learning of the model, it could be easily exploited. So I mean, a lot of people would say, oh yeah, those models are reliable, but you don't know if they have been poisoned, right? There's other ways to kind of do that as well. So that's kind of my bigger concern on one. And then I think the big one that I really get afraid of is deepfake. So I mean, the impact of that on the world is we'll just have to go and see. I mean, what do you really trust and believe nowadays, right? I mean, so did that if the world leaders said something and it can create a huge impact on the world? I mean, so those are like, a few things that I really worry about. But is that like, should that stop us of using AI? Absolutely not. I think that's the future. And if somebody, there's so countless benefits. So, and they're going to be always a battle between a good and bad. So I don't think that will be ahead of the curve and then proactively say that we can protect all the exploit or prevent all the exploits. So it's just going to be like, a battle versus good and evil and defenders versus attackers, as we have seen in the cyber world. So but AI is the future. So, but I'm definitely seeing that it could be misused. And if you're part of the RSA, I mean, one of the big concerns everybody was talking about is, how do we protect ourselves from all these exploits? So I let Aaron talk about like how what we can do good about it. But I think there's a lot of big concerns out there. So
Yeah, no, I would just add on in the concern dimension, mentioned it a little bit in the deep fakes, but it really lowers the bar for like crafting of a phishing email because you can sort of, and we actually did some exercises to use some of the LLMs to craft phishing for our senior executive population, and it like with some minor tweaks was sort of like spot on for something that a retailer would open up. So again, that the challenge there, and that's the super lowest hanging fruit. Very easy to do, but poisoning the models and some of the brand reputational damage that could come from that is also puts us in a bit of a perilous position. Now, on the positive side, there's the certainly like the resource augmentation part of having capabilities like security copilot and things that can help analyze your code or more rapidly make connections when you're doing incident response capabilities, tying certain activities that happened either network wise or email wise or data that your sim has collected, and really making your SOC analysts much more efficient. So it's just sort of the time enablement that will come from AI in that use case. Um, certainly you need to have considerations around the data security, especially if you're using some of the LLM capabilities as a corporation to enable training on your processes or engagement of your customers. You want to make sure that none of your data, the corporate data, is going in the big public models, right? So a lot of companies have super indexed on like, basically blocking that access from corporate networks. In addition to sort of the resource augmentation of some capabilities you can deploy, I think there'll be a lot more efficiencies just that come from the vendors that security programs are partnered with. Like that's the story I tell my board right now. It's not that at Albertsons companies we're developing any bespoke Gen AI capabilities in house, but that the vendors we are partnering with, whether that's from our email security or from our endpoint detection and response or from some of our data security partners, like they're embedding Gen AI and automation into their tooling, which will make that tooling more useful for us and help us run a more efficient program. Certainly for folks in like, a non-tech native company like I am, that's the real enablement, where we won't have the engineering resources to sort of build our own tooling around Gen AI advancements.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
Aaron,
think Aaron,
your comments around. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amit.
yeah, I was saying it applies to every organization, not just specific to what Aaron mentioned. I mean, it may be more relevant to him, but I think it's the same problem everybody's facing, and I 100% agree with what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really jumped out at me is the discussion about good news, and I think we definitely talked about this in the previous Zero Labs report, and we see the same thing in this recent report. It's really easy to see the bad news. It's really easy to see all the things that are going to make CISO's jobs even harder than they are and more complicated. But as we really did the 5 year projections and then applied recommendations, those projections, what really jumped out and was just unavoidable is those fundamentals. Doing some of those low cost, high impact fundamentals demonstrably change the outcomes a year from now, 5 years from now. And I think that really shifts a lot of things around from not just preventing what happens today, but how are we actually building resilient organizations? It's one of the things that the CISO advisory board here at Rubrik has challenged us to research on is like, how do you actually look at resilience and do that in a strong, sustainable way? And so that leads me to this next question, which is those things seem to pay off. That all the projections, all the models, all the numbers point to one way. But again, that's easy for me to run analytics. It's a whole different thing to do that in an organization. So I guess starting with Aaron, would you mind talking about when you look at resiliency, when you look at how to secure an organization from who knows what's coming 5 years down the road, how does that message land at an organization like Albertsons, and how do you do that effectively?
Well, I mean, I think resiliency comes from planning and assuming that the bad day will happen, right? If you just assume that you'll have status quo and operational uptime and no outages and no breaches, I think you've sort of failed from the outset. So really, instituting the right processes that can help you then get to the recovery phase that comes from that would be a component of resiliency. So planning for failure. Also, to the degree it's possible, I know for like companies that have been late to digital transformation and data growth, but like to the degree that you can govern the bloat of the data where it is allows you to be more refined in what you need to develop to be resilient. I think that's a big challenge for massive corporations. Data is everywhere. Data is on individual endpoints. Data is in the cloud. Data is on prem, and it is certainly untagged and unmanaged. And I think that creates challenges with resiliency. I think if you're approaching it and you're with a company that has sort of that initial outlook, like dimension the data that is most important, right? Like where are the key corporate assets? Where's the company corporate PII? Where's your customer information? I think if you start from that standpoint and sort of go down the pyramid, I think you can at least make some headway into how you would provide some resiliency capability without spending, 7, 8 figures to protect the super estate.
I think that makes a lot of sense. That matches a lot of what we see and what we hear from our organizations. Amit, how does that map to what you've seen over your time
Yeah, I
securing
mean,
organizations?
no, I mean, 100% agree. I guess don't know if I should add anything. Maybe just few things, right? I mean, as you said, get your basics right. Absolutely, first thing. Uh, make sure make sure that you know where your data is. I mean, which is difficult, and what data is important for you. And then, I mean, plan for failure and make sure that I mean, most of the people, I think now, most of the organizations are getting data resiliency to a point where I think it's improving on a faster rate than protecting data breaches, to be very honest. I mean, it's just, if you know where the data is, you leveraging some security platforms, it gives you 90% there already in terms of data vaults, protection. You can restore it. It's there. I think the challenge is more around how to really get real time data insights, and can you prevent data breach? Because the latest ransomware, they would just not encrypt your data, and will kind of you they will steal your data as well. Once the data is exfiltrated, then how do you it's too late for you, right, at that point. So the only way to protect that is to really do it real time. So if you have the insights to know what is going on, and have a risk score around each data access, I think that's what you potentially have a higher chance of being successful to prevent data breaches, right? And insider threat is another problem that everybody's facing as well. But again, I mean, with the same concept, it can be applied in both in insider and external threats. But I think that's kind of where I would say is a bit more challenging, and a lot more investment needs to happen. And good thing is we have the AI, and the machine learning to kind of do this process automation, the automatic response. It's going to take some while, I think, but I have confidence, and I feel that there's so much of investments happening in that space, and there are platform companies who are putting so much of effort there, so that we as organizations don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can just leverage what you guys are doing, and then just focus on our business problems, and then let the technology and the execution be managed by the platform company. So again, know your data. That's the difficult part, where it is, put the data rules around it, and then leverage a platform to kind of really do the part. It's a recipe for success, and can be easily replicated across the organizations. So then we can be ahead of the game, and otherwise we'll be always be catching up. So my 2 cents there.
Yeah, well, I'd like to end it kind of on a little more of a fun question. Amit, you mentioned, catching up and looking back and looking forward. As a reformed researcher and analyst, I love looking back how we got here. I love seeing what that means moving forward. But I kind of make that a little more personal. I'd like to kind of ask each of you to end this great session with, if you could go back 5 years and tell yourself something that you've learned and make yourself better for where we're at today, what would that be? What would be the one thing you would tell yourself 5 years ago that you wish you had in your pocket? Amit, I'll kind of ask you first, put you in the hot seat.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and and I think I have given some thought to it, to be very honest, in the past as well. Like, what would I do differently? And one thing and honestly, from the bottom of my heart, I think what I've learned over a period of time is this is a battle, right? It's an ongoing battle between bad actors and 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 good actors as well. And then you cannot do this alone. You need an army, right? So I mean, would I do anything different on the technology side? I mean, I knew what I knew at that time, right? I mean, there's not much I would change on that side. But one thing I would definitely change if I could go back 5 years, is go back and invest in building the skill sets and the pipeline on the for the cybersecurity professionals. I mean, I don't think I did enough to help the community and share the information, go out there to the colleges and institutes and motivate the young students to kind of really be excited about cybersecurity and what is there. And I think we are significantly short of skilled resources, and then we're going to be, in fact, more and more given where we are going. So if we don't invest in that now, I think we will be like really in trouble in the future, right? I mean, because I think we are losing good talent on other jobs, and like and we will probably be struggling more and more. So that's my answer. Yeah, go back and invest in building the skills and giving more to the community on getting the people excited about cybersecurity. That is what I would do.
I love that. How about you, Aaron? What would today Aaron tell yesterday, Aaron?
Can we put aside maybe investing in some chip companies 5 years ago?
Yeah, that's a
That's
good
that's
place to
something we
start.
all wish we would have done with the advancements in AI that we just talked about. But as Amit said, like the principles of security haven't changed much in the last 5 years. But in terms of like a component of security that I would have wished I would have emphasized more, it's really about getting identity right. I think what we see now is a lot of breaches are enabled by abuse and legitimate identities. And to the degree that we would have been early, could have been early adopters in passwordless, or using some human factors or non-phishable second factors. I think that would have prevented a lot of pain that we've seen companies go through over the last 5 years. So probably indexing a little more heavily on what I knew about sort of the identity architecture space and how identities and the accesses and entitlements that those identities have are used to really enable a lot of the breaches that we see today.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate both of you joining us in this session. I, as always, appreciate the CISO Advisories Board's efforts to help guide where we're going and the research that we're focusing on. So just, again, one last thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you
No,
so
thank
much.
you.
Our pleasure. Have a good one.
Well, that wraps up our summit today. Thank you so much for joining us. What a great series of sessions. I know I learned a lot. I hope you did too. So on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik Zero Labs for making this event possible. And thanks to all of you for attending and for your great questions. That concludes the summit. Have a fantastic rest of your day.